All right, what's up, everyone? It is me, Drew Manning, your host of the Fit to Fat to Fit Experience podcast, and thank you guys for tuning in to another episode of the podcast. I haven't been as consistent with my podcast as of recent, mostly because I promise I have a good reason. Mostly because I've been transitioning my business to focus more on retreats. So if you have been following me on social media, you've seen that I've been doing these things called conscious fitness retreats, and which requires a lot more of my time, and I haven't been as active with the podcast, but it's something I'm going to start getting back into because it provides more in-depth conversation of the things that I love to talk about. And today's guest is definitely someone that I love to talk about this topic, the topic of psychedelics. As many of you know, I've been very open to the power of psychedelics. Leaving my religion that I grew up in, psychedelics have been profoundly helpful for me, close friends, family, loved ones who have had amazing experiences with this medicine. I'll call it a medicine, not a drug, even though I think it can be used as a drug. Today, I had the privilege of talking with Paul Austin. He's the founder of The Third Wave, which is an educational program to help people become more educated about the power of psychedelics and how to use them correctly. They have a training course for practitioners that want to get certified. And then he's the author of a book called Mastering Microdosing. So he's a big fan of starting low and going slow with psychedelics. So he talks about the benefits of microdosing. If any of you guys are interested, he explains the difference between microdosing with psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms, and LSD, and how much you should start with and which one might be the right fit for you. And it was a really good conversation. You'll learn a lot about psychedelics if you don't know anything about them, overcoming the fears, letting go of control, and how to use them properly and not abuse them. And it's a great topic of conversation. With that being said, psychedelics for the most part are mostly legal in the United States. So be very careful. This is not me pushing and promoting the use of any illegal substances. It's my own personal experiences and Paul's education, sharing what he does with the third wave and his book, Mastering Microdosing. So hopefully you listen to this with an open mind, an open heart going into it, but I think you'll be educated a lot on just how powerful these medicines can be if you feel like it's the right fit for you. With that being said, before we jump into the episode, I have an announcement about my next conscious fitness retreat. We just got done with my second retreat, which happened in October. The next one will be in February of 2025, and there are approximately 8 spots left available. There's 15 total spots. If you guys are interested in coming, all you have to do is go to consciousfitnessretreat.com, and I'll put that in the show notes as well. Conscious, CONSCIOUS, fitnessretreat.com. And you can submit your application on there. I'll reach out to you to book a one-on-one Zoom call with me personally to see if it's the right fit for you. I would love to host you here. We don't do psychedelics here, but we do breathwork, which is the next best thing to psychedelics. It's psychedelics without psychedelics. That's what I tell people. But we also do a lot of other fun excursions and hikes and beaches. And this island is a very healing island. So the whole conscious fitness approach is to help you become the best version of you physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. And I would love to have you come. So consciousfitnessretreat.com. If you feel called to do that, I would love to have you here. It'll change your life. I'll be honest with you. That's kind of how it's been for every single person that's come here so far. And it's been amazing to see people's lives changed in a week's time. So yeah, check it out if you feel called at consciousfitnessretreat.com. And with that, let's go hang out with Paul Austin. All right, Paul Austin, welcome to the show, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Drew. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, man. Excited to go deep and have a deep conversation with you. I like to start out with your story, introducing yourself to my audience. Obviously, we're going to be talking about all things psychedelics and what you do in that arena. And I've had other people come on my show talk about psychedelics, but I'm excited to hear your perspective on these things. So let's start with with your story first, if that's okay, and kind of like connect the dots for us of how you stumbled upon the power of psychedelics in the first place. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so my path into this is a little more unconventional in that I started working with psychedelics 15 years ago at the age of 19. And even just a few years before that, when I was 16, I started to experiment with cannabis. And I grew up in a pretty traditional Midwest family. I grew up in a city called Grand Rapids, Michigan. Church and religion was very central to my upbringing. So my parents were very anti-drug, anti-rebellious behavior, like I was supposed to be this sort of obedient golden child, so to say. So when they found out that I'd been smoking cannabis at the age of 16, it sort of shattered their worldview and perspective. And I remember my dad sat me down one Sunday after church after they had discovered this, and basically was like, I haven't been this disappointed since my brother passed away in a car accident 30 years prior to that. So that's how big of a deal it was. They had been raised in the just say no to drugs era. They had never tried this themselves. And what that did is it really solidified that, okay, this experience was interesting. I had a lot of fun with it. I'm going to continue to explore. And so I'm going to have to hide a part of myself from my parents, because clearly, they don't understand and they don't really get it. And so that same friend who introduced me to cannabis then introduced me to psychedelics a few years later. Cannabis was fun. Like, I enjoyed it socially. I preferred it over alcohol at that age, but it wasn't as profound and life-changing as psychedelics were. When I started to do psychedelics, psilocybin mushrooms and LSD, I had profound realizations about the nature of self, my connection to nature and the environment. I had profound insights about, I would say, how basically how life is what we make of it. It's much more malleable than we realize and what we give ourselves credit for. And so those early experiences really set me on a path of wanting to live on my own terms and be as free as possible in that process. And so at 21, I moved to Turkey, where I taught English for a year. And then while teaching English, I started to learn about becoming a digital nomad and how I could start an online business and I could live and travel anywhere that I wanted. And so after teaching English for that year in Turkey, I ended up then traveling to about 80 countries over the next 8 or 9 years. And in 2015, I was in Budapest and was with a couple friends, and we were sort of noticing at this point in time, more people are starting to talk about psychedelics. Joe Rogan was starting to publish podcasts. Tim Ferriss was starting to publish podcasts about psychedelics. Cannabis was becoming quickly reevaluated. A lot of states had legalized it by that point in time. And there was more clinical research coming out as well about the efficacy of psychedelics for depression and addiction and end of life anxiety. So I just sort of saw where the ball was going, and I got ahead of the curve. And in 2015 started Third Wave as an educational platform so people can make informed and educated decisions about taking psychedelics, right? The benefits, the risks, the use cases, what to do, what not to do. And from the get-go, I've really focused on microdosing as an inroad, because my mission is to normalize psychedelics. It's to make them legal and available and culturally accessible for everyone. And I believe the best way to do that is by encouraging people to take very low doses to start with, at least, and that there's
Yeah.
real true potential in what microdosing can do for folks.
Dude, I love that. I have so many questions to start. First of all, let's start with your parents and that relationship. Did they ever come around to it or be more accepting of it? Or, did they kind of feel like they lost a son?
Yeah, I mean, so the great thing about my parents is they're very loving, and I've never been surprisingly disowned. So in 2019, about 5 years ago, Michael Pollan wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind.
I love that book. Highly recommend
And
it to everyone, by the
it's a
way.
great book. And my dad and I have this relationship where he'll read a book that I send to him, and I'll read a book that he sends to me. And so I sent him that book, and he actually started to microdose after reading that book. He became very open to it. And then soon after he started microdosing, I guided him through a higher dose journey with psilocybin. So my dad really did change his mind. He went from being very anti-drug and anti, all these things, to actually being open to attempting it. I can't say the same for my mom. Like, she hasn't done it herself, but she'll send me research articles that come out, or when 60 Minutes publishes something. So I think something I was blessed with is although my parents may have disagreed with certain decisions that I made, there was never a sense of, if you don't act this way, we won't love you, or you won't be part of the family. So we've always had a back and forth. It's a healthy relationship in that way. And, they've come around
Yeah.
substantially now to psychedelics.
That's beautiful. Thanks for letting me ask you that. And I have another personal question. Do you have any
Yeah.
kids?
I do not have any kids. I mean, I'm
Okay,
34. I would love to have kids. It's in the plan for down the
sure.
road, but I've been a little too much of like a free spirit nomad over the last 10 years
No, it's all
to
good. The
settle
reason I
down.
ask is like, okay, so you started your journey at 16. Would you be
Right.
open to your kids starting their journey as teenagers, or have you thought about that yet? Yeah, I know you don't have any kids yet. I have two teenage daughters myself, and so it's a question that I like to ask other
Uh,
practitioners in this field and space, like where do they land on, like a lot of us got started out of rebellion as teenagers. you
right.
know, would I be okay with my daughters? I don't know. That's why I like to ask people like you, like where you stand on that.
Yeah, well, I love the sort of frame of, we've been working with psychedelics for a very long time. They were often used as initiations for rites of passage, especially for men. And so if I had boys, then I would be open to creating a container for them that's like an initiatory ritual that would be utilizing psychedelic substances to help them go through this sort of ego death and rebirth process. Because I think for men in particular, that is especially important. Women, I think, would also benefit from it, but women don't tend to have the same egoic structure that men have. Women also have menstruation and even pregnancy as these sort of physiological rituals, whereas men don't necessarily. So I do feel like psychedelics, in some ways, the younger the better. And I don't mean that for someone who's like 8, but by time someone is 14, 15, 16, 17, coming of age, starting to come into maturity, right? Like, a ceremony with psychedelics could potentially be very useful. I think it shouldn't be done super often necessarily. But I do think it could be very impactful at an age like that.
Yeah. Thank you for answering that question. I really appreciate that a lot. I've always thought about that. I'm curious to know, this might be a tough question. With psychedelics, when, like, for example, when you were 16, I'm assuming, you were just looking to experiment. I don't know what your intention was behind wanting to try cannabis or other psychedelics in your teenage years. And as we both know, there are people out there who are, addicted to certain substances, who abuse them. There's always going to be people who do that. How do you know when someone is abusing the medicine versus, just using it to better themselves and want to, like, do you have any part of your educational system that kind of, educates people on, here's when not to do it if you're looking to escape your problems and just get high? That's one approach versus someone that's looking to come into this with intention of wanting to better themselves and do the work to improve their mental and emotional states. Does that make sense, what I'm trying to ask?
Totally. And I do
Okay.
think this is partly dependent on the substance that you're working with. In other words, it's much easier to abuse cannabis
Hmm.
than it is to abuse psilocybin mushrooms.
Sure. That
Um,
make
I would
Yeah.
I would also say it's easier to abuse something like ketamine
Yeah.
than it is ayahuasca, or
Yeah.
even LSD compared
Yeah.
to ayahuasca. So there is something about the context in which we work with these substances has an impact on whether or not they become problematic. In other words, just taking ketamine at a house party or alone at home and doing it 2, 3, 4 times a week could potentially be problematic. But if you're going into a clinic or you're going to a group experience and it's done intentionally and it's done once a month, more than likely that will be totally fine. It's not going to be problematic necessarily. So I think it's partly dependent on the medicine. And I will say, I have seen some people who, they start to drink ayahuasca as an example, and they end up going to an ayahuasca circle or ayahuasca ceremony. I know some people have been to hundreds, 100, 200, 300. And it's sort of like they continue to go back to this medicine because it does help them to feel better and feel good, but they're not necessarily putting in the work to change the necessary behaviors so they could feel great regardless of whether or not they're continuing to dip into psychedelics. And so I think the risk with psychedelics is that because they can often be so blissful, especially once you learn to work with them in a very intentional way, they can feel you leaving amazing, that there is this sort of, I'm going to give up my power to this thing outside of myself, rather than looking at it as like, okay, this is a catalyst, it's an opener, my brain's more plastic and malleable. For the 2 or 3 weeks after this high dose ceremony, I need to change this, change my life. And I'm going to commit to changing my life. That's actually much harder to do because it requires courage, it requires difficult decisions, it requires difficult conversations, it requires potentially upsetting or pissing people off, right? And usually it's just much easier to go keep drinking ayahuasca or just keep taking mushrooms. So I think there's also this sense of, do you have accountability? Do you have community? Do you have people who are supporting you in this? Do you have people who can support you as you're making shifts and transitions in your life that may be challenging and difficult? Because at times it can be really difficult to rip off the Band-Aid of the illusion of the life that we've lived. Um, and yet that's the most important thing often to do, is to face the dragon if we really want to see growth and development from working with these substances.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that can be said for anything that is intended to help people. That it seems to be beneficial, whether it's religion, whether it's therapy. People tend to repeat those patterns, even though they go to church or even though they go to therapy. It comes down to them actually applying the lessons learned in the experience to better their lives. So I think whether you do psychedelics or whether you're religious or you go to therapy or whatever tools that you use to better your life, there's always going to be some people who are just like, it's not sticking, right? It's not, they're going back to the experience that makes them feel good in the moment, but then they go back to those old patterns and behaviors that they get stuck in. So
Right.
I appreciate you talking about that. I want to dive really deep into third wave and kind of discover how you came up with whatever your philosophies are around psychedelics, and how did you come up with them? Because as we both know, there's new emerging data coming out about the science behind these psychedelics and what they do, and so how were you able to come up with, you know, um, I don't want to say rules and regulations, but just along those lines of like, here's what tends to work, here's what doesn't, and how did you create like a structure to that or a curriculum around that? Because I feel like, with religion, for example, let's talk about Christianity. I come from a very, strict strict religious upbringing where, I was taught that this one interpretation of religion was the one true path, right? And I'm just very curious to know, like, in the realm of psychedelics, which is new and emerging, you know, yeah, how did the discovery process come up for you of like, this is the way that tends to work well, and we're going to educate people on these philosophies and methods that maybe seem to work in real world settings with people that you guide through. So let's dive into like how third wave came about. It's a loaded question, I know.
Yeah, so I think the number one thing here is experimentation, meaning we so often, right? And this is why mainstream religion can be so valuable, because it provides a framework, it provides a structure, it provides a sort of easy thing for the mind to grasp, and it can just relax into it and integrate it, and it's taken care of, right? Like I grew up in the church as well. We'd go to church, you'd sing the opening hymn, you'd hear the sermon, you'd sing, a certain, you'd say the Lord's Prayer, you'd once a month have communion, and the whole ritual is set up, and you just show up and blah, 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 blah. And I think the difference with something like psychedelics is the experience with psychedelics is very enlivened. It's very somatic. It's very embodied. It's very subjective and personal. And so, my path Started at the age of 19 when I started to do mushrooms and then a bunch of LSD. And then I continued to experiment with mushrooms and LSD. And then when I was 24, I started to study all of these books. I probably read 20 or 30 books about psychedelics, about the history of psychedelics, about the scientific research on psychedelics, about the, neurobiology of psychedelics, about how it was helping veterans, about. So I just started to study and read, listen to podcasts, just absorb as much information as I possibly could, because it helped me to better contextualize and understand my own experiences that I had gone through with psychedelics. And then as I continued my own journey of growth and development, at the age of 27, I started to work with ayahuasca, because at that point in time, I felt emotionally stuck. I feel like I couldn't access certain forms of vulnerability. And I had heard and read that ayahuasca really opens the heart and can open the vision space and can, support that process. So I said, well, I'm going to try ayahuasca. I'm going to go work with ayahuasca and see what that does. So I always think with any development of, so you hinted at this, but we have a training program for practitioners, right? So now, I mean, I've been educating people in the space for 9 years, but the last 3 years we've put almost 300 people, practitioners, doctors, therapists, nurses, other medical professionals, executive coaches, health and wellness coaches. We've put them through our 10-month practitioner training program. And so a lot of that is my synthesis of my personal experiences, of the books that I've read, of, I have my own podcast, so I've interviewed hundreds of people at this point in time. So a synthesis of the information that I've interviewed those individuals from, research papers. And I'm always sort of the nut of this is I'm always looking to balance the first wave and the second wave. So the even the named third wave suggests there must be a first wave and a second wave. And so the first wave was the ancient and indigenous use of psychedelics, meaning ancient Greece, ancient India, and the Amazon, right? And there were very particular ways that we have worked with psychedelics historically. They've been in ceremonies, they've been in groups oftentimes. There's sort of an animist aspect to it. It's connecting you to a spirit or connecting you to the natural environment. There's typically some sort of shamanic part or sort of archetypal myth aspect to it as well. So a huge part of creating beautiful and effective psychedelic experiences is the ritual that surrounds it, right? When we work with these medicines. The other aspect, though, is, what we learned in the 50s and 60s, and what we're learning even more about today is certain medicines are ideal for certain intentions or certain purposes, right? And certain amounts of medicine. So a microdose of mushrooms is going to have a much different effect than 5 grams of mushrooms, right? And so based on the intention of what you're looking to accomplish, based on your background, who you are, then it might require a different type of medicine. So this is what I call the skill of psychedelics. That as we start to get into the psychedelic space, we come to realize that, okay, just like we can learn to read, write, play an instrument, start a martial art, we can also learn the skill of psychedelics. And that requires practice, experimentation, a mentor or teacher who is helping to support you, and then the willingness to do things by trial and error. That there's really nothing that replaces the capacity to experiment. That's how we as humans have survived for so long. Our ultimate skill is in experimentation, and being able to discern what works and what doesn't, and learning and iterating from that in a very rapid way. And so typically with folks who come into this, I always say experiment and start low and go slow, right? You can always take more. You can't necessarily take less. And that's why I love microdosing, because people can start to experiment at these low doses, observe and notice what's going on. And now they're becoming their own teacher, or even the mushrooms are teaching them in and of itself. So I think that lens as well is no gurus, right? No giving up our power, no whatever. It's like, this is about you. This is about your sovereignty, your choice, your autonomy, and psychedelics can help with that process.
Yeah, I agree with that. And thanks for explaining what the third wave meant and how all that works. And I think that's definitely something very relevant to, the day and age that we're in, with all this information being so accessible. like you said, Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, Tony Robbins, some big names, have really, opened up and talked about the power of psychedelics. I think it's becoming more mainstream, which I think there's a cost to that. There's a downside to that when it becomes more mainstream. But also at the end of the day, I think, the power that this medicine has to help so many people, because we've had such, you know, we've only had, like, and we're kind of had this bubble of tools that have helped us for so long: religion, therapy, books, and now we're kind of open to newer ideas of things that, you know, um, are we can back it with science now. Psychedelics being this powerful medicine if used correctly, right? There's a wrong way and a right way to use the medicine, and I think you've done a good job of explaining what the risks are. Maybe when would not be the best time to use it, or who would not benefit from it as much as someone else if it's being abused. So I'm grateful that something like third wave even exists in this day and age, because we went to describe the second wave. That was kind of like a huge experimentation phase without a lot of structure, just like, hey, take this, that makes you feel good. And then it got shut down pretty quickly and banned. And then we went through the whole anti-drug dare program era of, like, hey, all drugs are bad, just lump these in with the rest of them. And now we're like, wait a second, we've kind of been lied to a little bit about this. So I'm grateful for that. I want to dive into your book, Mastering Microdosing, and let's talk about what that entails, and maybe even get into the specifics of, okay, if you're going to microdose with mushrooms, psilocybin, or LSD, what does that look like, and what should people be aware of or know about, mastering microdosing, if you will?
Yeah, so microdosing is a fairly nascent topic, right? We've been using psychedelics for thousands of years, but this concept of, oh, I can take a little bit, 2 or 3 times a week rather than a lot of bit, once every 6 months, has really brought a new lens and a new perspective to how we can utilize psychedelics. And the key with microdosing, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners have at least heard about it at some point, is that microdosing is what I would call a sub-threshold or sub-intoxicating dose of a psychedelic. So there's no visuals, there's no, major journey things. It's a dose level you can take and still navigate your everyday reality. For most people, that's a 10th to a 20th of a regular dose. For mushrooms, that might be 100 to 200 milligrams. For LSD, that could be 10 to 20 micrograms. And it's really critical that for someone who is interested in microdosing, that they commit to doing it 2 or 3 times a week for at least a month. And the parallel that I'll draw is with something like meditation or even weight loss, because I sense that might also be a topic of sort of interest for this audience, right? That when you're looking to sort of lose weight and get healthier, you don't go to the gym once and then step on the scale and expect that you're going to have dropped 40 pounds. It's not a reasonable expectation. And I think a lot of people expect, oh, I could just microdose once or twice and it's going to totally change my life. And that's often not the case. That microdosing, just like weight loss, it requires commitment. It requires showing up consistently. It requires doing the work for an extended period of time. And what's beautiful about microdosing is it accelerates things because of its impact on neuroplasticity. It helps people have a better mood, more energy, better sleep. And so, what they've shown in clinical research with people who are microdosing is that once they've done it 2 or 3 times a week for at least 4 weeks, so a minimum commitment of a month, then that is where the greatest efficacy is seen on mood, energy, and sleep. And so when I'm working with clients, or we even have something called the microdosing experience. It's a group coaching container that I lead through Third Wave. And so when new folks come into this, I always say, first, we need to find your dose level because everyone is unique. And so some people are more sensitive, some people are less sensitive, some people prefer mushrooms, some people prefer LSD. So let's first assess what's ideal for you and how much is ideal for you. Then we commit to doing that 2 or 3 times a week. Usually with LSD, I say twice a week. Psilocybin mushrooms could be as much as 3, if not 4 times a week. That's because LSD is much more activating. It's much more stimulating because it's more active on dopamine in particular. And so people find that, okay, I'm getting a lot of energy from this. And my worry sometimes if people start to do LSD too often is it will create some mania. So LSD twice a week, mushrooms 3 to 4 times a week. Focus on doing it for at least a month and then have an intention. I think that's the other critical component of it. That microdosing is not a magic pill. It's a catalyst for neuroplasticity. It will help you make those changes. It's going to help you have a better mood and more energy and get better sleep, which will naturally lead to better relationships, better decision making, right? Taking better care of yourselves. But you still have to be willing to show up and make that change, right? So many of us are conditioned, and we're seeing this in the weight loss space right now with Ozempic or semaglutide. I just want to take a pill, or I want to get a shot, or I want to take this peptide, and that's going to fix my issues, right? And I think we have to learn that, um, you know, it can take work sometimes to shift the patterns of our lives, right? And the willingness to sign up for that and commit to that and see it through is what distinguishes, let's say, the haves from the have-nots, right? Those who are living a meaningful and fulfilling life, and those who are just sort of passively consuming existence as it comes along. And so microdosing is just a tool, it's a catalyst that makes that easier, makes it more accessible, but the individual still has to want to change. It just makes that change a little bit easier.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned intention, like set an intention, because that's something I work with a lot of my clients on, just with eating food. Like, the food's not necessarily good or bad. What's your intention behind wanting to eat the food that's in front of you? Like, if it, or a sip of alcohol, same kind of thing. Like, I don't think alcohol, I mean, alcohol, yes, is a toxin. It is unhealthy for us. But if your intention is to escape your problems, numb the pain, and distract yourself from the work that needs to be done, and you're drinking it because you're sad and you're lonely and you're going through hard times, that's completely different than being at a wedding, celebrating family and friends and bonding. Like that's a totally different experience, right? Same thing with LSD or psilocybin. If your intention is to get high and escape your problems, and that's all it'll be. It'll just be a drug. Versus, like, I'm going to this with the intention of wanting to let go of this pattern of behavior that's been holding me back, that's been weighing me down, and I want to, increase my neuroplasticity to figure out a way out of this maybe loop that I'm stuck in. So I love that you mentioned that, and I think that's super important. No matter what you're doing, it's just being intentional, which just puts you more in the present moment. Kind of put you, out of the subconscious autopilot into the conscious mind of like, okay, why am I doing this? Why am I here? What's this for? But I think that's powerful. I've never really taken that approach to microdosing of committing, 2 to 3 times a week and, for 4 weeks straight and seeing if that can make a difference with certain things that I'm trying to work through. So I'm very interested in that, just me personally, but I think people listening, might be interested in that as well of learning to master the microdose. And it sounds like it's something that you kind of coach people through, to kind of like tweak things here and there. How would someone know which medicine to start with? Like, let's say that they want to try microdosing and just getting started, like, and they've never done anything. How would you guide them to know which one would be the right one to start with?
Yeah, typically for people who are like brand new at this, I usually advise something like psilocybin mushrooms. That's partly because they're legal in certain places now, like Colorado and Oregon. There are also a number of cities, Seattle, Detroit, DC, um, Oakland, that have decriminalized psilocybin mushrooms. And even on Third Wave, we sell a mushroom grow kit, so people can buy a grow kit from our website and grow their own mushrooms, so people can also grow it themselves. So mushrooms just tend to be much more accessible, much easier to acquire. If someone could access LSD and they knew for sure it's LSD, it's good LSD, et cetera, then the main distinction is LSD tends to be better for if you feel like really stuck, if you feel low energy, if you feel lethargic, if you feel like you just can't get things going, you're missing a fire in your life and you need a bit of a kick in the ass, LSD is really good to like get kind of energy going. right? It's almost like a pre-workout in that way, where it'll be like, all right, let's do this, let's get it going, you know? Whereas psilocybin, I find, tends to be better for people who are maybe a little overstrung. You know, they have a dysregulated nervous system. They might be anxious. They might be moving too quick. They might, you know, their brain chatter, their mind chatter might be going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. So that, I find, psilocybin can help to balance it, so someone can calm down and come a little bit more into the body. The other distinction that I would make is someone who's interested in flow and productivity and creativity, right? Typically are drawn more to LSD, because LSD has something to support that cognitive flexibility and clarity. Whereas someone who might be more into like therapeutic work, right? Depression, addiction, anxiety, right? They're seeing a therapist, they have a clinical condition. I usually find psilocybin is a better substance to start with. So, um, but that's you know, we spend an entire class session on that oftentimes, right? That process of discernment between them is important. And the caveat of all of this is these are generalizations. Everyone is unique, and so even how I've communicated this, again, these are generalizations. Your experience could be very different depending on where you're at and what's going on for you. So take all of this with a grain of salt is usually what I
Love
tell
that.
folks.
I love that you said that. Um, let's see. There's two questions that I want to ask, and I'll start with just one of them for now. Is overcoming the fear. How have you seen, just the fear of like letting go of control? People that are new to psychedelics. I know a lot of people have this fear, anxiety about like what's going to happen. What if I get stuck like this? Like, what if I do something crazy or weird? Right? All the fears. What have you seen help people overcome that fear of like diving into this and really, being open to the experience?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to the willingness, right? If someone feels like they're being forced into this or thrown into this, that's not a great way to come into psychedelics. It's like being thrown in a cold plunge or a bunch, cold water, and you don't want to be in there. It's miserable and you hate it. So I think the first step is a willingness, an openness. I would say the second step after that is to start low and go slow, right? And that could mean something as simple as, before you go and do a psychedelic, maybe you do breath work, and it's Wim Hof breath work that you're doing, or something called holotropic breath work, which is a bit more of an intense hyperventilation type of breath work. So doing some breath work, going to a float tank, right? Spending time in a float tank, sitting in that float tank for an hour and seeing what happens, right? So by doing that, you're starting to understand your sort of inner world or inner dialogue better. You're starting to see that reality isn't just what I see externally, but there's actually a whole internal landscape and world that maybe I was not as aware of prior, right? And then once you've started to get a lay of the land that way, then usually what I advise folks is just to start at a low dose. So if you're interested in doing eventually a high dose of mushrooms, start with microdosing, which is about 100 to 200 milligrams. Then maybe try a half a gram, then try a full gram, then maybe try 2 grams. Then you can maybe go up to 3 to 4 grams. And as you get into these much higher dose levels, have a coach, a guide, a facilitator, a therapist, or even just a friend who's experienced with this, who's there for you to support you through it, right? But there's the frame that I usually provide is there's no rush, right? And sometimes people who do rush in because they're desperate, or because they were pressured by another person, or because that's just the nature of who they are. There are some people who dive really deep in the deep end, and it can sometimes be really difficult. It could be traumatizing. It could be too much, right? Psychedelics are not trivial substances. They are very powerful, and not everyone has the cognitive flexibility to pop out of a 5 gram mushroom experience and just go back to life as normal, So it's okay to work your way up there, because the power of psychedelics is that they destabilize, right? And destabilization is, it's a two-edged sword. It's both helpful because it interrupts our default pattern. It helps us to see things from a new perspective. It helps us to recognize and realize that some of our attachments, or some of the things that our habits, how they're holding us back. But also, destabilization means that some people who go drink ayahuasca in the jungle come back, quit their job, divorce their wife, move, move to Croatia, and end up living on a yacht. And whether or not that was the right decision, um, we'll never know. But typically, what we tell people is wait 30 days before you make any big life decisions, because things get shaken up with psychedelics, and you need to let things to start to settle before you start to, divorce your partner, quit your job, move abroad, join
Yeah.
a band, whatever that might be.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And you mentioned breathwork. I'm a breathwork practitioner, and I've seen that it's like a mini psychedelic experience without the psychedelics, where the whole concept is letting go of control as you go deeper and deeper into this, altered state, if you will, as you're breathing this certain pattern that kind of puts you into that psychedelic realm where people feel high. And it is kind of scary at first if you've never let go of control. So I think that's a great segue into psychedelics is breath work, from what I found. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because I think there are a lot of people who are scared of psychedelics because of the programming that we've had about drugs, and all drugs are bad, and so it can be scary for people. So I like that. And then kind of starting out with microdosing first, I think that's very, very smart. And I'm glad that there's, people have access to your book, Mastering Microdosing, and then Third Wave as a tool to kind of up their education, so that they know what they're getting themselves into. Because yeah, psychedelics are very powerful, and just going into it like, oh, I'll give it a try and see how it goes. Most likely, if something hard or scary comes up and you don't have the tools to navigate that, or you have a guide with you, it can be very difficult, and you're stuck there. You can't just like, push the reset button, or like, go back once you're in it. So, um, I'm grateful that like people like you are very vocal and going on podcasts and educating the masses about this, because I think we need that, moving forward. Um, where do you see, like, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, the accessibility and psychedelics becoming more mainstream, kind of coming at a cost. And I think what I mean by that is, people abusing the medicine, people, maybe using it in the wrong way, or the downsides to psychedelics. Where is your hope for this movement, and how would you like to regulate this, or how would you like to see like some type of regulation over this in the future? Like, let's say it becomes legalized, right? Awesome, people can go to their local store and pick it up, and you know anyone can have access to it. Is that what you foresee happening, or how would you want it to look, where people have to go to a therapist or someone like you to access it, to where they have to have some type of guidance or education? Or where do you see this going in the next 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, so right now, Oregon has legalized psilocybin mushrooms, and Colorado has legalized psychedelics. So all natural plant medicines, ayahuasca, San Pedro mushrooms, iboga, and a few others. Massachusetts has it on the ballot this upcoming election cycle. So in about 2 weeks, when we have our election, it will be also on the ballot in Massachusetts. As I mentioned before, we've seen a number of cities that have decriminalized plant medicines. And this year, there was an organization called Lycos Therapeutics that attempted to get MDMA approved for PTSD through the FDA. However, their application was rejected. And so it will still be another 2 or 3 years before the FDA approves a psychedelic to treat depression, addiction, anxiety, et cetera, et cetera. So I would imagine, right, my best guess is that within 5 years, we will have additional medical access to various psychedelics that will be covered by health insurance and much more efficacious than conventional psychiatric medications currently. So I think in the next 5 years, we'll start to see more and more people transition or shift to working with psychedelics over SSRIs, especially as a first line of defense. So rather than a doctor someone comes in, they say they're depressed, they're not feeling well, rather than a doctor going, oh, just start taking this SSRI. My hope is that doctors are to go, okay, first try something like ketamine, or first try psilocybin as a first step, and then if that's not helping, then we can go to what might be beyond that. So that's going to be one aspect and element. I think the second aspect is that psychedelics will follow a similar path as cannabis, in that we saw, I mean, still federally, cannabis is a Schedule 1. But we've seen, I don't know, I've lost track now of how many states, but I think it's something like 14 or 15 states have legalized recreational cannabis. Another probably 20 to 25 have legalized medical cannabis. I know Florida is the next big state that has it on the ballot this election to legalize it. The only other one after that hasn't yet would be Texas. That would be the final really big state to do it. So I think psychedelics will follow a similar pathway. My anticipation would be that the Massachusetts ballot passes, Washington State soon follows. We'll see California. We may see New Mexico. We could likely see a state like Michigan or New Jersey or New York also start to look at it. So you'll start to notice more and more states are going to legalize it at that level. And then broadly speaking, this movement to decriminalize plant medicines, like what happened in Oakland, Seattle, and Detroit. And decriminalize means it's the lowest law enforcement priority. So it's not technically legal. You can't sell it through dispensaries, but people can have it on their person. They can utilize it. They can access it without fear of law enforcement. I would imagine that will just become and generate more and more momentum and traction in various cities. And there will be this sort of trifecta of access. If someone has a medical diagnosis and they feel best in going to their psychiatrist or their medical doctor to get support, they can go that route. If someone wants to access it at the state level, maybe they're a healthy normal, right? They don't have a clinical issue, but they still want to explore psychedelics. They could do it at the state level. And then there will be a lot of like local community groups and churches who take advantage of the decriminalization thing and host experiences in various cities where people can come and sit with mushrooms or ayahuasca or San Pedro, or, microdose with other friends and go on a hike, what I like to call microdosing. So my anticipation would be, in 10 years, the majority of Americans will have legal access to psychedelics. And then within 20 years, that's the more interesting part, right? Like, how will this change our paradigm of mental health care? How will this change the drugs, the way that we perceive drugs and how we utilize drugs for creativity and performance and burnout and these sorts of things, right? How might psychedelics help us to remember our relationship to nature and actually build companies that are more conscious, that are focused on regeneration, that have a social impact around them, right? I think these are some of the bigger questions about when you have people in leadership positions, CEOs and founders who are starting to wake up through psychedelics. How might that change the way they structure and build their organizations in the external world?
Mm, dang. I love that. Yeah, I'm excited to see where all this goes. And I'm hopeful, when that when the FDA recently, dismissed MDMA for PTSD, that was kind of like, oh, that sucks. I was hoping that we'd be ready for that as a society, but maybe not just yet. But I'm hopeful. Last question for you, and I meant to ask this earlier in the podcast, but you mentioned weight loss. Have you had experience with psychedelics and weight loss? And if you have, what have you seen, or how have you seen it be beneficial if you have used it for that specific uh, practice? I'm curious to know.
So we did some research. I mean, I don't have, my problem is weight gain. I'm one of
Oh
those
yeah, yeah,
people,
yeah. You're an
like
ectomorph.
I can eat and eat and eat. And I'm
Yeah,
actually
people
like
want
in a
to have your
bulk.
that.
Yeah, I'm actually like in a bulk phase right now, and I'm like having to drink, a gallon of milk Feels like
Oh,
every day just to try
yeah.
to get some mass on. But with weight loss, like a lot of that comes down to behavioral change, right? And so even one of my old projects was we did legal psilocybin retreats in the Netherlands. So we had people come in, we had them work with psilocybin truffles, and we did a survey after the fact and asked them, how did that change your behaviors and practices? And we found that a lot of people started just having a much healthier lifestyle. They became more particular about the food that they eat. They started to focus on, exercising more and moving more. And so there has been some early research on how psychedelics are a appetite suppressant. So one interesting thing for your audience to look into is how low doses of LSD are a fantastic appetite suppressant, how they're really healthy for the gut. They can provide a lot more energy. And so that's what I was talking about earlier for your audience. I think microdoses of LSD are potentially a fantastic thing because they really get the metabolic system moving and energized. One diet I've been, just for fun, one diet that I've been checking out lately is the Ray Peat diet. Do you know about the Ray Peat diet? So Ray Peat was this, this is a slight tangent, but we'll have a little fun. He was sort of like a mad scientist type PhD, and he talked a lot about the importance of thyroid health. And so a lot of what he recommended diet from a dietary perspective was what's going to support thyroid function. So he was very anti-estrogen, all about progesterone and how you get more progesterone in your diet. He actually talked a lot about the importance of fruit and fruit juices, also high fat like butter, coconut oil, fatty cuts of meat. Um, he loved saturated fats and fruits because he was looking at how it could help to support thyroid function and metabolic function. And so, what I'd love to see from a research perspective, and this hasn't happened yet, but how psychedelic use may shift things at the epigenetic level, right? And so, how could working with psychedelics help to turn off certain genes or turn on certain genes that can help us to become healthier in the long term? And part of this is just the behavioral change, moving more, eating healthier, right? Being more mindful about what we put into our bodies. But I think also physiologically, right, there's something that happens with psychedelics, and I would not be surprised. I mean, I've seen some companies in the sort of hype phase of psychedelics the last few years that have raised money to bring psilocybin through clinical trials as a weight loss drug, right? So it's happening. Weight loss is one of, if not the biggest businesses in the world, right? Especially in the United States. And I would be way more a fan of everyone doing psilocybin than I would everyone doing semaglutide, for various reasons. So I think it's worth exploring and worth looking more into, but we're still pretty early stages overall when we're looking at that research for psychedelics and weight loss.
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll see where it goes as it becomes maybe, more and more legalized or decriminalized. More studies can happen with
Right.
specific applications. So, yeah, I love that, and I think we're always looking for the magic bullet. What's the quickest way, easiest way to change who I am? And there are no shortcuts, right? I mean, I think that at the end of the day, you're going to have to do the work. But I think what I've learned about psychedelics and how they've helped people is, develop a sense of self worth or some
Right.
self love and even some self respect. And I think as you develop that, you want to naturally you tend to want to treat your body and yourself, your identity, with more kindness. And I think you realize, like, I've been abusing my body with eating junk food, escaping my emotions. Just same thing with alcohol, or certain drugs to numb the pain. Food is a very accessible drug that does a great job of numbing the pain. Like it does. Like our highly processed junk food that we have tastes delicious. You can access it anytime you want to. And I think that's a really hard battle for people to overcome. But I think as people, find ways of more self worth, whether that's through psychedelics or other means, it tends to lead to better decisions with how people show up for themselves and how they talk to themselves as they develop that self love. They're like, you know what, I'm worthy of having good physical health. I'm worthy of taking care of my mental health. And that includes having to do some hard things like move my body. That's hard. That's uncomfortable. Doing a cold plunge sucks. Like it's uncomfortable. But these kind of hard things tend to build the resiliency and get us the results that we're looking for. And I think people just start to show up for themselves differently as they develop that self-worth and more self-love, whether it's through psychedelics or other, avenues. So anyways, Paul, you're awesome, man. Seriously, I'm very interested in this third wave program, to be totally honest with you. As a
Awesome.
breathwork practitioner, I've seen the power of, these tools and modalities helping people heal and feel a little bit less broken. And I'm interested in learning more about this. And I'm grateful that you came on to educate me and my audience about this. So grateful for what you do, man. Any last words or anything you want to say to those out there that, maybe, are thinking about this or maybe thinking about taking the leap? Like what words would you have for them, if any, if you want to?
Yeah, I mean, my advice always is like learn, educate, read, listen to podcasts, like just get a deeper lay of the land, have a sense of what you might be stepping into, talk with friends or mentors or a coach or therapists, right? Write down some questions. I mean, it's why I created Third Wave in the first place, right? That is a fantastic platform. We have a ton of guides all over that website that you can go click through and explore and learn. So just learn. And then if it's feeling right for you, start low and go slow, and let us know how we can help. We have a lot of programs, and I have the book and various other things. We have this microdosing experience that's coming up in the new year that folks can sign up for if they want more hand holding and group coaching. So I would say get involved that way. And then if there are practitioners like yourself who are interested in this, who are wanting to learn more, we also have new cohorts that start every couple months. And as part of those cohorts, we do an intensive in Costa Rica where we do psilocybin ceremonial experiences at a epic venue right on the Pacific Ocean in Costa Rica. Um, so that you can find out more information about that at Third Wave as well. So that's thethirdwave.co. And then folks can find me on Instagram at paulaustin3w. I'm also on Twitter. And my personal website is paulaustin.co. So if you have any questions, anything else folks want to explore, reach out to me and I'm happy to help.
Thank you, Paul. Really appreciate you coming on, man. And we'll be in touch very soon. So have a great one. Take care.
Thank you, Drew.